Welcome back. This is Lecture 15, Late Antiquity Part 2, or Christianity in the Western Empire, essentially from the rule of Constantine through the rule of Justinian. So ultimately, what is beginning to happen at this point is that the Roman Empire is entering its period of true decline. So ultimately, the Christian faith has become the dominant and official religion throughout the empire. However, following the reign of Constantine, by the time we hit the year 410, Rome itself will be sacked by the Visigoths. And so one of the major challenges then is, how do we proceed in our understanding of both the religious aspect, the artistic aspect, and the historical aspect of the empire itself? So Constantine had divided the empire essentially under his two sons. So Arcadius had become emperor of the East, and his capital was in Constantinople, which is where, of course, Constantine had moved his capital. The city had been called Byzantium. It was renamed in Constantine's honor, Constantinople. We now know it as Istanbul. Honorius was the emperor, son of Constantine, remained emperor in the West, and he, after the sack of Rome, was forced to move his capital to the city of Ravenna. So the two rival cities, Constantinople and Ravenna, are sort of the two centers of two halves of the empire. Essentially, though, the more populated, more prosperous, more successful half of the empire is the empire in the East, and it will eventually become known as the Byzantine Empire. For all intents and purposes, however, it is the continuation of the Roman Empire. We'll be concentrating right now on the end of the western half of the empire and the artwork of the Christians during that period. So on this map, you can see in that greenish shaded area the western portion of the empire. You see in the sort of reddish salmon color the eastern half of the empire and the location of Rome and Constantinople. So we've seen the tradition of architecture moving from just the simple post and lintel and the peripteral style of columns around the outside of a rectangular structure from ancient Greece, being transformed by the Romans into the basilica style, which has more solid walls around the outside of a rectangular structure, uses rows of columns, colonnades of columns, to create side aisles around a large open space with rounded areas for altars, or in the case of the basilica in the forums of ancient Rome, the seats of the judges. The administrative aspect of the basilica building supplants religious ideas. That structure, though, changing from temple to basilica, is going to be transformed once again now by the Christians into what we think of as the Christian basilica or cathedral form. So for the most part, these buildings will remove an apse from one end. That becomes our main entrance. The opposite rounded end becomes the location of the altar, and very frequently you'll see the addition of a crossing aisle or transept in order to create the structure of a cross when the building is seen in its floor plan or seen from above. So you can see that we have a kind of seamless continuation of Greek ideas into Roman ideas into Christian ideas. The Romans are going to absolutely adapt building forms that they are already using to serve their newfound interest in Christianity, and that is very much the case here in the construction of the first church of St. Peter's, or what we refer to as Old St. Peter's. So Peter is essentially the first bishop, first pope of the Roman church. He is buried at this site, and so this church is built on top of his burial space, and it is very much in the Christian basilical form. You notice that it is a longitudinal, symmetrical along a central axis form of architecture. The rows of columns essentially form two side aisles here on either side of a large central space. That central space is referred to as the nave, and that allows our focus to be directed toward the apse, toward the altar section. There is a transept in this early design, although it is a little bit closer to the altar or to the apse end of the church than becomes customary later. In this cutaway, you can see side aisles and you can see the height of the central nave. Notice also that that necessitates there being the addition of windows at a higher height, since windows low down would not allow a lot of light in because of the roofing on the two aisles. So it's not only functional to have the windows above, but it also creates a sort of religious experience. The light spills into the space from on high. Certainly other cultures have deified or believed that their gods lived on high. We saw the ziggurat, we saw the Greek Acropolis, but in this case we are also meant to think about heaven when seeing light spilling into this structure from above. The original roof of the building and ceiling would have been truss made of wood, so this building did eventually succumb to wear and tear. It was in fact completely overhauled and redesigned in the Renaissance, and so there is a new St. Peter's built directly on top of this site. The row of windows I referenced earlier is referred to as the clerestory. Some people pronounce it clerestory. The colonnade of columns creates this form of arches along the side aisle, and that area of that elevation of this wall along the nave is referred to as the nave arcade, the columns and their attendant architecture above. The space in this case that's blank here would have been filled with mosaic and or fresco, but the row of windows is referred to as the clerestory or clerestory. So we've dealt with the nave, the side aisles, the apses, the round indentation space here where the altar is. The narthex is your vestibule or porch at the entrance. So the narthex is here. This open space, the atrium, actually somewhat recalls the structure of a Roman house. And if we recall, the Christian faith began, the preaching began within private homes. The church was a home, so it sort of makes sense that that would continue here as well. This is the Basilica of Santa Sabina, and it really is a great example for us of an early appearance of a Christian church. This particular building does not have a transept, but it's the closest thing we can look at to what Old St. Peter's would have looked like on the inside. So you get a really good sense of what the Christian basilica form was like from this rather beautiful but somewhat simple design, obviously clearly based off of the Roman basilica model. This is another Roman basilica that has been extensively overhauled, but it does include some of these remarkable mosaics. And so we know that the artwork that's been lost from some of them would have been pretty intricate and made primarily of what we call tesserae, the small stones or glass squares that are used almost as small tiles to create these images. Another form that is rather remarkable in early Christian architecture is the central plan. The basilica plan tends to be the longitudinal rectangular form, but some churches were built in this form, either round or octagonal forms, with an altar in the center and a row of columns separating an aisle around the outside that we refer to as the ambulatory, and then you'd pass through the columns to this inner area where the altar is now. This is the Church of Santa Costanza, which is in Rome. And so again, you see that on the outside, the churches are less spectacular than they are on the inside. Most of the decorative work at this stage is done on the interior. So again, we have our central plan being different from our longitudinal central axis plan of the basilica. The ambulatory is essentially the aisle that is formed on the opposite side of the main area, separated by a colonnade. So you have the ambulatory here. Technically, you also have the ambulatory around the altar in this area here at the apse in a basilica style. The santacostanza decoration on the interior is really rather remarkable. We have a lot of it still intact. This is a really interesting case where we see a connection between some of the pagan tradition and connecting that into this new religion. This is clearly a grape harvest and the stone grapes to make wine, so it is in some respects a reference to Bacchus, but in another respect, of course, it represents the idea of the Eucharist, the ingestion of the bread and wine as the host, the body and blood of Christ. So we see that in some ways the pagan traditions are beginning to fuse a bit, and certainly the artistic traditions are fusing as well. Some of these elaborate floral and plant-like motifs are things that we've seen in decoration in Roman homes really all the way back to the Republic. We definitely see more overt reference to historical religious subject matter in carvings, often in the form of sarcophagi, or in this case in the form of boxes. Here we have the suicide of Judas and the actual crucifixion, which is a little rare to see at this stage. But you can see the difference between the art styles of the early Christians and the art styles of the people who are continuing the pagan traditions. These are kind of remarkable ivory carvings, in some respects similar to what you just saw in a Christian form. These are from two established families in Rome who held on to their pagan religious beliefs. So these are actually in two separate museums now, but we believe they were meant to be a pair, probably made at the same time. They obviously are artistically joined and look as though they should serve as a diptych, as a two-part single piece. You can see that the attention to the anatomy is more accurate. The portion is more what we're used to from classical era. We see the contrapposto pose. We see that quote-unquote wet drapery technique, revealing the form but concealing it for the sake of modesty. Both female figures here are associated with oak trees that represent Zeus/Jupiter. Jupiter would be the Roman name, of course. They wear crowns of leaves that represent their association with Bacchus as well, so they are most likely making offerings to the god as if they are priestesses or are about to become priestesses themselves. So we can see that there's a difference, not so much in the function of these objects. These are function as religious objects, but you can see those clinging to the pagan tradition are more focused on the accuracy of naturalism in the body, whereas the artists who are focused on making artworks to serve the Christian faith are more interested in quick read of the symbolic aspect of those forms. You certainly can see that in some of the objects in Ravenna. Now, Ravenna, of course, is going to be the capital of the West. It will, of course, though, have some influence from the more dominant empire in the East. And one of the things that we'll see that really does translate from the East is the use of gold. And we see that a lot, especially in the halos and backgrounds behind sacred figures. You also see that in the deep purple that is worn, in this case, by Christ, but is meant to sort of connect him to the empire as well, connect him to the role of the emperor, the royalty. So again, the object that you're looking at is in the Western Empire. It is somewhat influenced, though, by the style of the Eastern Empire. This building is the mausoleum of Galla Placida. It is thought, or was originally thought, to be the tomb for Theodosius' sister, Galla Placida. We know that she, though, actually died in the city of Rome, so it's unlikely that this was used for that purpose. It is a remarkable building, though, in that the exterior seems extremely plain. It would have been attached to a larger church, so it did serve as a funeral space, a funerary space. The building itself is made from repurposed Roman brick, so this is a sort of building that began its life in another form. It is repurposed material. But in the Christian tradition, it is very plain on the outside and the decoration is on the interior. You can see that the rather elaborate ceiling does have a deep bluish color with these forms that read somewhat as stars or sunbursts. That tradition goes all the way back to Rome. We saw similar decoration, in fact, even in the Pantheon. You do see, again, the role of Christ as the shepherd here as opposed to Christ on the cross.